I'll start with a little introduction about what motivated us to organize this panel. And I want to say that as a queer woman, I've always felt that I must work in both feminist and LGBTIQ movements because those are my life experiences. And the truth is that sometimes that duality has felt effortless and sometimes it has felt fraught. I sometimes feel too queer for the women's rights movement and too feminist for the LGBTIQ movement. And the irony is that there are so many dykes in the women's rights movement that I should never have an issue. But I think that's the conversation for when the camera's off. The intersections between women's rights and LGBTIQ rights have always made sense to me because at our core, we in these two movements are fighting against traditional notions of sex and gender. We are fighting for bodily autonomy, and we are fighting for the principle of self-determination. And so in recent years, I've been troubled by two forces happening simultaneously. So one goes back to 2018, and some of you may remember this, but a group of self-identified lesbian feminists stored London Pride with transphobic rhetoric, and it was disgusting. And I remember hearing about it from friends in London that day, and I assumed that it was a one-off. Surely anyone who identified as a lesbian or a feminist should clearly stand in solidarity with transgender people who are literally among the most oppressed based on their gender. But I was wrong. And that ugly action became a harbinger of things to come. And we've seen a growth in transphobia everywhere, including, unfortunately, within the women's rights movement. This is unacceptable, and I believe that it moves the entire feminist movement to the right. We're supposed to be fighting for everyone, not just women, and not just certain kinds of women. These politics of division hurt us. The other troubling force for me is the rise of so-called gender ideology. And a lot of us in this space have been hearing different versions of gender ideology for a long time. So we might even remember the origins. Decades ago, the Catholic Church developed this term, so-called gender ideology, to condemn feminists and to condemn LGBTIQ activists. They claimed that our efforts to secure rights for ourselves would literally destroy morality and traditional families. And the anti-rights movement now organizes in opposition to issues like access to abortion and birth control, comprehensive sexuality education, trans rights, equal marriage, diverse forms of family, even science. And more recently, what's been so disturbing is that under the gender ideology movement framework, we've also seen an attack, a very successful attack, on democratic institutions and multilateralism. To be clear, this has been an effective strategy. The opposition has used this framework with varying degrees of success to protest equal marriage in France, to build a formidable ethno-nationalist movement in Poland, to nearly sabotage the Costa Rican presidential election a couple of years ago, and even to justify protests of the Colombian peace accord. I could go on and on, but I think the point that is so important is that this framework is effective. These are not just academic debates. We hear it in the anti-sex work rhetoric and the anti-trans rhetoric, and we see it in the policy struggles that leave each other out. So I won't go into all of those, but I think our panelists will give some excellent examples. And I think the point here is that the opposition has no such problem seeing the commonalities between those working for women's rights and LGBTIQ rights. And I think there's an opportunity for us to seize our commonalities as well. And so one of the questions is, how are we doing working on intersectionality on these issues and other forms of marginalization, and how can we do better? So I don't know the answers, but I know people who have many of them. And in this context, I gravitate towards people like our panelists today, who as individuals and in their institutional affiliations inspire me. It was important to lift up CREA, AWID, and Madre, as organizations that are seen as primarily working for women's rights, but that wholly embrace intersectionality, including with regard to sex, gender, and other kinds of marginalization. And it was important to me to showcase the Global Philanthropy Project's excellent new data about how the right is funding the opposition to our work. So let me start us off with an icebreaker. The bios for our speakers are in the chat, but let me just read their names out so that you have them. We have Lisa Davis, who's an associate professor of law and co-director of the Human Rights and Gender Justice Clinic at CUNY Law School, and also the senior legal advisor at Madre. We have Ezra Berkeley Nippon, who's the senior program officer, thank you for waving, Ezra, for knowledge and learning at GPP. We have Geeta Misra, who's the co-founder and executive director of CREA, and we have Hakima Abbas, an African feminist who has been active in social, I don't know why I'm reading your bio, but I didn't read anyone else's, but maybe because you're special. Full bio in the chat, Hakima, who's currently the co-executive director of AWID, a global feminist movement with membership organizations across 180 countries. So my first question is for all of you. Was there ever a time when you've been in a women's rights space where your queerness wasn't seen? And have you ever felt too feminist in an LGBTIQ space? So in sum, how do these intersections hit home for you? Is there someone who'd like to go first?
So just one specific example, many of you know the film Fire that was made many years ago by a Canadian filmmaker, but two middle-class women that are married into family and fall in love. And basically, I was part of a women's rights march where a set of people that wanted to emerge as a small lesbian organization at that moment wanted to carry banners which said women and Indian and lesbian or something. And the women's rights movement that was organizing the march was fighting about the right wing that was attacking the film, saying they needed to protect freedom of expression of the filmmaker. And at the same time, they were telling the small emerging lesbian queer group that was emerging, saying, oh my God, don't carry your banners because you'll muddy the waters. Can you just march with us as part of being part of the women's rights movement? And I remember this moment where thinking that there was no consciousness about the fact, on one hand, they were demanding the protection of freedom of expression from the state. And on another hand, they were crushing the freedom of expression of a small group of people so that it wasn't seen. I mean, this is 26 years ago or 28 years ago, but it's, you know, it's been one of those moments that is etched in my memory. Thank you.
Thanks, Geeta. Who'd like to go next? I see your microphone off.
Yeah, I can jump in, Jessica. So I remember a time where I definitely felt too queer for the women's rights feminist movement. It was a meeting in Senegal where a group of women were talking about whether you could be a feminist and be homophobic and transphobic, as a serious discussion of, but I've also felt too Black and African for the LGBT movement. I've been in spaces where I remember leaving a meeting that shall remain unnamed saying, well, ultimately could we end imperialism too as we liberate ourselves as queer people? So yeah, all of the intersections.
Thank you, Hakima. And thank you for also bringing anti-Blackness into the conversation. which obviously is something that the queer movement needs to do much better work on. All right, let me ask you, Ezra, and then you, Lisa.
Well, I was just thinking, like, basically, I'm in my early 40s now, but really since my teens, I've been I need a space that does both, or that makes those connections. So I've been trying to seek them out or build them. So I don't have a specific example to offer, but just, that's my orientation. And what that looks like for me now, at Global Philanthropy Project, is that we're often supporting our members from grant making organizations to step into spaces that may not share those, those connections and that analysis. So that would be like organizing pre or post like briefing or strategizing spaces, or like sessions at a larger conference or, event, side meetings, et cetera. So, I think that actually the shared attack that we're under by this so-called anti-gender or gender ideology movement has in some ways been helpful to clarify that, great need for that, the spaces to build that shared, intersection or analysis or whatever. So, yeah, very relevant to this conversation. And thanks for having me.
For that example, Ezra. Lisa.
Well, a lot of my scholarship works on sexual violence, and I've been invited to a couple of different conferences talking about sexual violence, where I've been on panels where the panelists were talking about sexual violence committed against men, which of course is a serious issue. And they were talking about it in the terms of the context in Afghanistan and Syria. And what they said was, as documenters, they hadn't found any examples of sexual or gender-based violence committed against women, which was just so striking to me, because of course, like all countries in the world, sexual violence and discrimination happens against women. And certainly in Syria and Afghanistan, where it's been well documented over time. So to say you can't see it or it doesn't exist, and to pit victims against each other was just so hard for me to listen to. And not only that, but of course, then there's this conflation of sexual violence against men versus sexual violence against LGBTIQ persons. And being able to unpack that conflation and see the discrimination that underlines sexual violence that happens against women and LGBTIQ persons, I think is some of the work that we need to be doing in our movement.
Thank you for that example, Lisa. Geeta, I'm going to you for the next question. And we've talked a little bit about how the language of gender ideology or the so-called anti-gender movement is confusing, and the stakes are really high, because if we don't get the terminology right, well, then they command the discourse. So I wanted to ask you, what should we be calling this opposition framework, and what do you think is at stake?
Great, thanks. It's one of my favorite questions to respond to. I think we have to first just kind of take a moment and step back and say that this term is being used by right-wing opponents to attack those of us who assert sexual and gender rights, while simultaneously conjuring fear of a world order destabilized by feminists and trans people. And the term is being used by us, by sexuality and gender right activists, to describe a right-wing backlash that seeks to co-opt human rights language in service of promoting conservative or reactionary values. So I think it's a clever move by the right-wing forces by adding the words gender and ideology. By calling it an ideology, the attackers are invoking, fear of a terrifying, powerful way of thinking about society that will destroy old ways and which brainwashes its adherents into fanaticism. And the victims of this ideology are the traditional family. That's how they present it, in which old good values are foiled by plots of feminism, LGBTQI activists, and allies with progressive politics. Adding gender to ideology as part of the attack calls kind of, on the earlier histories of deploying gender as a scare word. So I think the challenge for social movements fighting for sexual, reproductive health and rights, LGBTI rights, and racial and economic justice is to unpack the right wing's gender ideology playbook. What is new? What is old? What sites is it manifesting in? Why is it so effective? And most importantly, how we can respond to it. So I just want to say two more things. One is what is new about this, if you call it a playbook. As an Indian, I didn't know what a playbook meant. I had to get into the terminology of Western, that games, there are playbooks in games. Anyway, so what's new about this playbook? I think, from a lot of the work that Kriya has done, we kind of categorize what's new about this playbook are four things. The writers of the script are comprised of a newly broadened and increasingly secure alliance of right-wing actors. That is crucial. Number two, the targets of the attacks in many settings have shifted. They're adding more antagonists to the script. So that you already said feminists, so abortion, contraception, LGBT activists, same-sex marriage, sexuality are still favorite villains. But in many settings, a particular intense vitriol is directed towards trans people. Number three, the playbook now co-opts human rights language rather than disavowing it. And number four, the new book relies more and more on criminal law as a tool to achieve its goals. And, we can go into each of these, but I don't want to do that here. And I think the three ways that feminists can think about a response is one, reflecting on our movements, how our own movements create hierarchies, our own movements create exclusion. Are we willing to notice and challenge who is in and who's out in terms of how we define gender and work together? The second component is, how do we acknowledge that a feminist analysis and rights work is part of an ideological shift? It's not fanaticism. We want to change how people think about these issues. So, how do we position our thinking? So that's one, reflect on our movements. The second is rethink our strategies, because, it's backed us as feminists into an uncomfortable corner. We see that our old strategies are no longer working against these new players and tactics. So can we still persuasively claim that the right wing is anti-democratic when it uses democratic tools like popular referendums, citizens' initiatives, things that we used to do? In an age of majoritarian politics, we cannot take for granted that law and policy are tools of power and they work for us. And, we need to invest in other sites of transformation like arts, media, and technology. And my last point that I want to make is we need to think about shifting discourse. It's something that should be a fundamental project for all of us in the feminist movement, in the LGBT movement, which is, to date, we've tried to expose the agenda behind behind traditional family values. That's, people will see it's hypocrisy, look for alternatives. But we know US, Brazil, Poland, India, these politics are being used to roll back the hard-won rights. So, our challenge is to articulate what we are fighting for, not only what we stand against. So I will stop there. Thank you, Jessica. I don't know if that answered, what you asked.
That was really excellent. Gita. And I like your point very much about focusing on what we are fighting for instead of only what we're fighting against. I think that is so profoundly important. And I'm trying to follow the chat as I go along. I'm doing a mediocre job doing it, but I do see that Ezra's parents are here. So hi, parents. That is so adorable. I can't even handle it. And Gita, Hakima, Lisa, I'm a little disappointed your parents aren't here. But I wanna appreciate something that Neela said in the chat that I think links with Gita's comment, which is not only that we might need to find a different name, but in a sense, we need to reclaim and own gender ideology as a philosophy of liberation. And I think there's something really to debate there. Can we, they've taken our term, right? Gender comes from us.
We need to call it anti-gender, not gender ideology. I forgot to say that, even though that was my opening big thing.
I read your mind though. I knew you were doing that.
Saying gender ideology, we're giving it more teeth.
Well, that's
Understand
the debate. So I think we know one of the questions. Do we change the terminology? Do we stop saying gender ideology altogether and change it to anti-gender, like Gita is saying? Or we take it, like Neela is saying, and say, reclaim gender ideology, make it our own. I'm going to leave you with those questions, although I did see Hakima unmute herself. So I'm going to invite you to comment, Hakima, on that. And there were some other questions we discussed. And I just want to, so I want to invite your intervention. And I also want to ask you how we avoid the tactics of division, because I think these are very much linked concepts.
Thanks, Jessica. Sorry, I got excited there. So I wanted to come in. I think one thing that's really important to know, you use the word backlash, Jessica. And what's really interesting about this kind of use of gender ideology, as you said, it came from the Vatican about 20 years ago, but it emerged as a reaction to some of our gains as feminists and as LGBTIQ, GNC movements, particularly around Cairo and Beijing conferences and the ways in which sexual and reproductive rights and gender was first placed on that kind of global human rights agenda. And now, 20 years later, of course, we see it invoked in relation to a lot of things, as Gita said, comprehensive sexuality education, the rights of trans people and violence against women, sexual and reproductive rights. But it's important to understand that anti-rights actors claim to oppose gender ideology, but they themselves invented the concept in order to oppose it. So there's something really weirdly circular about that. And they do so because of the gains that we've made in our movements, where we refuse to be put in the place that they put us in, the natural order that they seek to suppose and impose on all of us. And it's a really powerful discourse. It's a one that resonates in many corners of the globe. Why? Because it's so almost adaptable. It's flexible, right? So in Europe, it's understood to be secular, but also Islamophobic, but can also be translated to Muslim contexts. And in Latin America, it's firmly Christian. And they've created almost a body of supposed, and I'm using lots of air quotes for people who can't see me, supposed knowledge and science around the terminology. And as Gita said, using the words gender and then ideology puts into question our very existence as non-binary people, as trans people and families and communities, and almost makes it seem like gender is a falsehood or a propaganda. And as you said in your intro, that has really far-reaching impacts. It has, you mentioned in passing the impact on the Colombian peace accords. And that's huge. Colombian voters really narrowly rejected the peace accords after a campaign by ultra-conservatives led by the Catholic Church and the Evangelic Church around gender ideology based on the text that recognized the differentiated impact of the conflict on women and LGBTQI people and GNC people. So as Gita said, they cloak it in human rights, but in fact, it's the opposite of the universality of human rights. And those who claim this discourse around gender ideology understand feminist and LGBTIQ activists to be conspiring to impose a worldview. They see us as together. If you take, for example, Citizens Go and the ways that they attack trans rights, they attack abortion rights, and really using horrible language, and lots of tactics that come from us. But we've seen that horrible trend as well in recent years, where gender ideology discourse has been taken up by people who claim to be feminist or women's rights activists. And that segment of women's rights activists, although I hate to call it that, define binary biological sex rather than gender and all of those things. And they attack directly trans people and trans women in particular. And it means that they're making horrible bedfellows. There's an organization called Hands Across the Aisle, for example, that brings women who identify this way and conservative Christians together to work together to fight against trans rights. And it's really important. And here I'd like to honor like Black, trans, gender queer, intersex, and gender non-conforming family who are fighting for us all in all of our struggles and really literally putting their lives on the line for us. So we have to hold that vision of a feminist future that celebrates us all, where all of our basic needs are met and we're able to fulfill our full potential, and really claim and ensure that we understand that oppression, someone else's oppression isn't taken away from our own, that liberation isn't a zero-sum game. And maybe I'll end there.
The mic drop line, Hakima. Liberation is not a zero-sum game. Abso-fucking-lutely. Thank you. That was very, very powerful. And I'm really appreciating very much your point about the flexibility of the anti-gender movement and how it can shapeshift depending upon the regional context. That is a very, very important point. The way it's anti-Muslim in Europe and, you know, connected to Catholicism in Latin America, that is a dangerous movement, one that can simultaneously seem indigenous and actually be global. And I am very much enjoying the chat and just want to encourage everyone to keep jumping in. Your wisdom is so deeply appreciated, and your anger and your reflections. Ezra, I'd like to go to you next, if I may. Let me just think actually what makes sense. Ezra or Lisa next? You know what? If it's okay, Ezra, I'm going to ask you to hold for a moment, because I think your data is really going to scare anyone who wasn't already freaked out. So I'd like to go to Lisa to continue us in this sort of like conceptual framing. Lisa, you have the floor.
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting how the feminist and the women in LGBTIQ movements have also worked together to try and make positive shifts in our language. And really here I'm talking about the transition from violence against women framework to the broader gender-based violence framework. And we know that the violence against women framework is problematic because it reinforces this binary view of gender that's inconsistent with queer and feminist theory. And that work of the movement to really shift the discourse on that language was done in large part to capture the gendered nature of violence that's experienced by all people who are vulnerable to discrimination based on their gender, which, you know, was really specific to LGBTIQ persons, but more recently also capturing non-binary and gender non-conforming persons. But the term gender-based violence, while it's gender neutral in that it doesn't expose the gender identity of the victim or perpetrator, it still encompasses gender oppression, and that's key. Because when we're talking about, and I'm just going to respond to a question in the chat, when we're talking about cisgendered heteronormative men who, of course, also experience sexual violence as gendered crimes, the nuance is critical. Because, you know, when cisgendered heteronormative men, you know, they face stigma associated with sexual violence, but oftentimes part of the humiliation tactic involved in the violence is to invoke the indignity of being treated as a woman or as a homosexual. And it's often about that emasculation or homophobic shame. And in this way, the discrimination works to reinforce pre-existing gender narratives that are prescribed to women and LGBTIQ persons in an effort to abuse heteronormative men who subscribe to them. And that's not to say that sexual violence against heteronormative men experiences any less egregious, or that it may not be gendered, but it's erroneous to group sexual violence committed against heteronormative men with sexual violence committed against women and LGBTIQ persons without explaining how the discrimination impacts these groups differently. Otherwise, we fail to address the underlying discrimination that's often reinforced in policy and law. And it's that discrimination that women and LGBTIQ and gender nonconforming and non-binary persons face, that discrimination that motivates violence, that perpetuates violence. In fact, violence, really gender violence, is a tool used to reinforce discriminatory and oppressive narratives, to control based on gender. And we need to always be recognizing that when we're looking at gender-based violence and understanding the nuances and not conflating them so that we can get to that underlying discrimination, which is why it's so important to do movement building between the women and LGBTIQ movements.
Thank you so much for that. You know, Hakima and I are currently very active in the Generation Equality Forum process, and I know a lot of people who are in this chat right now are as well. And one of the conversations that's happening that makes me anxious is there's some activists within that space who keep trying to insist that one of the groups, the Action Coalition on Gender-Based Violence, is actually the Action Coalition on Violence Against Women. And I wish those actors could have just heard you, Lisa, because I think your point is so important. We don't take away from women's rights or undermine women when we use the broader framework. Actually, by using the broader framework, it strengthens our ability to analyze who does and does not have power. And so, you know, we have to keep fighting for that GBV framework, and you just made that point so clearly.
And I would just add to that too, that the framework, gender-based violence, helps the women's movement too. The Violence Against Women old framework, which I will say our feminist foremothers fought very hard to accomplish. And we're really just evolving in the discourse by bringing it over to the GBV framework. But the GBV framework helps women too, because the old VAW framework doesn't recognize the vast range of gender discrimination and violence that happens against women. It's very specifically siloed to sexual violence. So it doesn't include domestic violence. It doesn't include women as gender nonconformers who defy their roles when they go out to, you know, make decisions around their reproductive choices or employment or marriage or whatever it is. So in the same way that oppression works against women, as in those similar lines to LGBTIQ persons, the GBV framework works for all of us. So.
Thank you, Lisa. We're going to move next to you, Ezra. And I know that you have some slides, and I've been told that you know how to share them. Is that correct?
I could share them, but I think Elise is going to. Is that right?
Let's clarify.
I said, well, in the setup for this, I think Elise did say that.
Okay, no problem. Then that must be the latest.
But I can if needed.
No, not at all. I see Elise is here. Hi, Elise. We're very happy. Welcome.
Thank you.
Ezra, do you want to set them up, or are we going directly into slides?
Well, why don't you go ahead and put up the first slide, Elise? But what I wanted to do is just acknowledge, as Jessica said, that this is depressing, you know, like we're outfunded kind of information, but I want to just like sort of upfront say, one of the what do we do now answers for my organization, Global Philanthropy Project, which is a network of LGBTI funders, is that we're organizing this conference called Shimmering Solidarity Global Rights Summit. And I just want to encourage people, it's a conference for grant makers. So grant makers here, check out attending this conference. And for people in civil society, share it with your program officers and talk to them about the potential for being invited as a content expert in a session submission. And this is a conference to bring together grant makers across regions and across funding issue areas to talk about just this issue and how we make the connections. And it's really got like some of that future vision and like what are we fighting for, not just the opposition piece woven into it. So I feel very excited about the like, what do we do from here, that we have at least that one next step. So now to the less fun part of this. Global Philanthropy Project worked with our member organizations and additional partners, philanthropic partners, to develop two pieces of research. One of them, a report mapping the funding of this anti-gender movement, and the other one mapping the progressive philanthropic response to that opposition. So this report, those were private documents for a set of grant makers. This report that you see a slide for here overlays the findings from those two documents, and it adds a third piece of comparison using the funding of the global LGBTI movement as a way to sort of, put it all into perspective. So we can go to the next slide, and thank you. So in this slide, what you're going to see is the findings offer a very clear call to action. Progressive movements and their philanthropic partners are being outspent by hundreds of millions of dollars each year by some of the main organizations within this anti-gender movement. And the oppositions providing that funding, the institutions providing that opposition funding, have developed sophisticated and coordinated systems to learn and co-fund and expand their influence. So funds received by anti-gender movement institutions in the US are being redirected around the world by about 100 million a year by only 11 key organizations. And we know there's much more unreported funding from the US as well, in addition to funding flows that are coming from other regions, other countries that don't have the sort of US tax reporting requirements that enabled us to track what we are showing here. So, the progressive funding response, we were able to identify in the coming years about $45 million that's going to come online to support those of us who are pushing back against this. That is, a vast, that's much less than we're up against, and it's a big increase over what's been, clearly marked for this work in previous years. So now we can go to the next slide. Thank you. And this slide is just a map to visualize the funds that we can document, exporting this anti-rights political agenda from the US throughout the world to different regions, and acknowledging that Russia is part of Europe, but it has like sort of a different funding landscape. So it's identified as its own section. And then the next piece, slide 4, we can go to. And thanks everybody for sharing the links. And I know Elise is going to be posting them, and Maddie from GPP is posting them too. So GPP, Global Philanthropy Project, in a collaboration with funders for LGBTQ issues, creates every 2 years a document that tracks all LGBTI funding globally that we can track. And we took that data set and compared it to what we know of the anti-gender movement. Now, to acknowledge, the anti-gender movement is up against much more than the LGBTI global movement. It's also anti-feminist and all these other sort of agendas, but this is one way we can look at the scale. And as you see here, in the 5 years that we had data for both sets, by region and by total, we're just way outmatched. So truly disturbing. I want to encourage people to download and use this report as a tool to help make the case to your grant makers about and other supporters about why we need this funding for this work and how big the scale is. So that's there you go. That's the sort of overview of the key points in the report. We can talk about it more in other questions or conversations. Thank you. Great. And that that resource, I think, is for sort of our collected, what we've seen about this funding and about this our learning. So sharing resources. Thank you.
Ezra, that was great. Thank you very, very much. And I think people are probably still processing the intensity and size of those numbers. And I really appreciate your point that these are not point-to-point comparisons between the Global Resources Report and the anti-gender movement data. But nonetheless, I think on one of the first slides, what I saw you say is that you estimate that $6.2 billion is going into anti-gender work, of which $1 billion is from a mere 11 US-based anti-gender organizations. So we're talking about sums of money that the the global LGBTIQ movement can't even imagine, right? And what is there? There's like 600 million a year that goes for LGBTIQ rights globally. So scale is radically different. And did I understand that the response from progressive donors is a new 45 million, which is still far short of their 6 billion?
It's a little bit, so back to the 11, like one of the things is that that we understand is like faith-based organizations don't have to report in the same way as like a sort of another version of a nonprofit. So it all depends on sort of what's trackable has to do with US tax law in a lot of ways for these numbers. It's not exclusively that, but that's the majority of what we're looking at. So that's why we're saying, there's a much bigger network of funding out there, but even what we can easily track and document is so vast. For the 45 million that we're talking about, it's a little bit complicated because, funding for the anti-choice movement is funding that is opposed, is part of the movement that is opposed by this anti-gender movement. So we're asking people to be, when we did this research, it was not what is all of your funding that could possibly touch people who are impacted by the anti-gender movement, but to try to hone in a little bit more on like who's doing work that is really engaged in this. And so yeah, it would be, I don't know if I would say it's 45 million that's new money. I would say it's like, some of it is, but some of it is, there's like an overlap with the ongoing work that is, correlates to this specific movement, sort of avenue, because it's all connected. So our work for, like people with HIV and AIDS, sex workers, migrants are all going to be, impacted by the bad politics of this anti-gender movement, right? But not all of that funding and mobilizing is engaging specifically with that opposition work, So we're saying this is what we see that's coming for this work, and some of it is new, which is great, and has been developed over time by this work in progressive philanthropy to make the connections between these different movements.
Excellent. Thank you, Ezra. Thank you for giving me one more reason to not fall back asleep when I wake up in the middle of the night. We have a number of questions that have come in. And Hakima, I see that you have a comment to add. So let me ask you if you'd like to jump in here. And then Lisa, I have a question from the chat specifically for you.
Yes, it was just a little piece about the funding. I think what's also interesting and maybe a place where we can push back is that many of the donors are executive of companies. So we traced, for instance, Citizen Go donors. Some of them were in IBM, Nestle, and then there are Spanish billionaires who are funders of some of these groups. where we trace those individuals and where they're sitting and things, maybe that's also a point in terms of how we can fight back. One other point, if I may, Jessica, is that I did want to say that anti-rights discourses aren't only trying to exploit this fault line, but also others. And I think the fault line, for instance, around disabled rights and abortion rights. And here I'd love to uplift the work of Kriya and Gita and the team at Kriya around bringing those movements together to make sure that we have a conversation and not allow ourselves to be divided in the ways that they're targeting. But also amongst Black movements, claiming that the abortion industry is targeting Black women. So there are lots of different divisions that they're trying to create in order to weaken us as movements.
For those points, Hakima. And a while ago in the chat, I also saw a point from Mauro commenting that some of the gaze of the anti-gender movement is now focused on this sort of false rhetoric of saving transgender children, which also speaks to the way they're sort of swooping into the children's rights movement and trying to position themselves yet again as the protectors of children, when in fact it looks like what they really want is to control children. Except when it comes to protecting children from sexual violence. Lisa, I saw a question for you from Nora. Did you see the question, or why don't I read it out? How do we ensure that gender and gender equality efforts in the human rights and sustainable development spaces have the potential of highlighting how violence against cis men can also be gender-based violence too? Or is doing so the wrong approach because, as you said, the framework becomes vulnerable to being co-opted by anti-gender and men's rights movements? Is this the wrong question to ask?
Yeah, I think it's kind of going along the lines of what I was saying before, that, from a legal point of view, we have to look at the difference between, sexual violence committed against cisgendered heteronormative men and sexual violence committed against women and LGBTIQ persons. And the main difference is that underlining discrimination, that context that perpetuates the type of violence that's being imposed and why it's being imposed and how it's being imposed and where it comes from. Because usually these discriminatory beliefs and attitudes are memorialized under policies and law. And so when we're looking to address gender-based violence, particularly in post-conflict contexts, we miss that underlining discrimination. It's invisible. We're not even looking for it. And so we're not looking for victims based along gender lines. We're not looking for survivors of these crimes. And we miss a whole population. I mean, think about it. How many conflicts have we had where we've had really a robust set of documentation of crimes committed against LGBTIQ persons or crimes committed against women that go beyond sexual violence? Very, very little, but we know it takes place. We know it happens. I mean, there's even a name for the crime. It's called gender-based persecution. That's the crime that you would charge under international criminal law. But for some reason, even though we've had this law around for decades, there's never once been a single successful prosecution of gender-based persecution in any tribunal around the world ever in our history. Why is that? And it's because we don't understand what gender-based crimes are. We don't understand that they go beyond sexual violence. In fact, it gets conflated with sexual violence, which it certainly includes, but gender-based violence is so much more. So now I'm talking about that kind of violence that's done for discriminatory purposes for crimes that we do recognize. For example, rape, torture, and murder. So we know these are crimes, but when rape is committed or torture or murder is committed because of gendered reasons, that part we don't capture. So for example, under ISIS, women were tortured because they took their gloves off because they were out of dress compliance. They were doctors trying to do their duties, and they were tortured for taking their gloves off. Youth were killed for wearing skinny jeans and hair gel conflated with LGBT. Some of them may have been, we don't know, but they were killed for their appearance of looking gender nonconforming. Men who were accused of being gay were thrown off buildings. Women accused of being lesbians were issued death warrants. And what do all these crimes have in common is that they are all forms of gender oppression, right? These crimes were committed based on gender discrimination. And sure, we'll get the rape, we'll get the torture, we'll get the murder. But if we don't get why these crimes were committed, because of a gender narrative, because of a prescription, an anti-gender ideology by perpetrators to control and oppress them, if we don't get that part of the story, we're missing half the story. And we're going to miss half the victims. And we're going to have an incomplete historical record of what happens. But if we do capture it, if we can recognize it, then we can start working towards normalization of equality, of gender equality on a broader scale. But, getting back to the chat question, in order to do that, we have to unpack how sexual and gender-based violence works on lines of privilege, which in legal sense really means on the lines of discrimination. So I hope that helps answer the question.
Thanks, Lisa. That was great. Geeta, I want to go to you next. I know you wanted to jump in with something, and I want to also see if maybe as part of your response, you could speak to a question from Francisco. Francisco asks, how do we make sure that to address root causes and some of the main drivers of so-called gender ideology, religious fundamentalism, in quotes. We don't want to lose it from our discussion and strategies. And he notes, I put religious fundamentalism in quotes because I'm referring to the more extreme side of all faiths working in gender ideology.
Yeah, so maybe I'll link what I wanted to say with even the question, because I was thinking.
I can say one thing, just so everybody knows, we have to wrap this session in 5 minutes. So Geeta's going to be the last word. No, it's great. You're perfect. But I just want to invite our panelists. We're not going to get to all of the questions and comments in the chat, but they're brilliant. So just go through, and if you see anything specific, please, I invite you to post your responses there. Thanks, Geeta. Over to you.
So one of the things I was thinking while everyone was speaking, and a colleague reminded me, I think I don't know why 4 seems to be a number that's cropping up, but for all of us, we need to think about the language and, learn about the history of some of these, so it's like the root causes. Where's this coming from? What's the history? What are their actions and strategies and the impact? And as we were speaking, I was thinking that it would be good for us to actually keep pushing anti-gender, anti-rights, rather than just anti-gender. Because if we don't say anti-gender, anti-rights, we may lose the connection of the forces to fascism and the deeper attacks on our democratic structures and rights. We lose intersectionality. The way people who are poor, low caste, disabled, because they are also severely oppressed by these same forces. And, and also the added access of white supremacy and supremacist, ideologies. So I think if we get some of our, consensus on what we call it and how we name it, and then learn and unlearn, where it's coming from, and then have a series of strategies and impact, I think then obviously, in a country like mine where there is a lot of religious fundamentalism, it's the creating of the other, if you don't fit the narrative of Mother India and you're a Muslim in India today, the whole nationalist agenda is about a particular kind of Indian. So I think, and then it's linked to religion, which may not, so how do we unpack to figure out where it is also about anti-rights, about a particular set of people that are guaranteed constitutional rights under the Constitution of India, which is meant to be secular, meant to be democratic. So it's, I think for all of us as feminists, as activists, as queer people, our project is to really think, kind of change the way we think and act, and really figure out how our interventions can I want to go back to the stand for something and keep pushing an agenda that's ours and not just be reactive. And, last but not the least, gender to me has become a big umbrella term. Everyone has a gender, just like everyone has a race. And if we can think of gender as gender 360 and not just as something that's binary and belonging to 3 people and not 5 people, and then begin to think about how we do our work, we may be doing, we may be in a larger umbrella where we include more people and more forms of discrimination. Thanks.
Thank you, Geeta. Yes, yes, and yes. I'm with whoever you are, Ellen Woodsworth, I'm agreeing with you. That's how I felt listening to you, Geeta. Okay, we're gonna wrap up this session now. I want to, before I attempt to summarize, I'm not even gonna attempt to summarize. Before I make a couple of reflections of my own, I've been asked to remind everyone to please fill out the questionnaires about how we've done in these sessions. It really helps us to figure out what's useful for you all when we do another Out Summit. I think I will tell you, this was the most highly attended workshop in this session block. And I actually feel like that's very inspiring. The other sessions in this time block are also incredibly important and incredibly good, but it shows that this topic strikes a nerve with us, that we're angry, that we see the threat, and we want to mobilize together. So part of what's coming to mind for me is like, what are the other convening places? What are the other vehicles that we have to continue to fine tune our arguments about how to hold these right-wing forces at bay and how to unite broader? And I think what has been very useful to me personally in this conversation was the way we very much broadened it. It started in a sense with looking at how women's rights and queer rights advocates are natural bedfellows and sometimes pitted against one another. And we just blew that concept open and said, we need to be working alongside children's rights advocates and disability rights advocates and racial justice advocates and sex worker advocates. Like, the way to hold ground, it's not going to be through outspending the opposition. It just isn't. Like, the numbers are really stark. Maybe we'll get there one day, but we are not there now. So the way we're going to hold ground is by out-organizing them. And the way we out-organize them is by community organizing. It's by being intersectional. And I want to wrap up by, I don't want to wrap up, I want to keep going by saying, one thing I always think about with this is that the opposition has taken our term. Gender was our term. They only wanted to talk about sex. And they were forced to concede that gender exists by coming up with this clunky concept of so-called gender ideology, which immediately decouples gender from sex. It says that it acknowledges that there is an element of social construction. And if we can do that and get them to use our language, well, then it's another example of how we're winning. Thank you all so much. We're going to wrap up this session. Post a little applause for our panelists in the chat. They have been stellar and extraordinary and just delightful to work with.